The city was wrapped in sunlight that morning, the kind that makes you forget the rot hiding in its alleys. I'd been telling myself things were finally quiet. No missing heiresses, no gang feuds spilling onto the sidewalks, no desperate husbands with guilty eyes. Just a stretch of calm long enough to make me wonder if I'd finally earned a little peace. But peace and I never get along for long. That phone rang, slicing through the stillness of my office, and I knew the quiet was about to end. The mayor's voice came through the receiver, steady but strained, like a man trying to pretend the walls weren't closing in on him. He told me bodies were showing up all over town, not the usual kind either. These weren't the back alley disputes or the drunken bar fights that kept the coroner busy. No, these bodies were wrong. Skin stripped away on some, organs missing on others, limbs gone like pieces off a broken mannequin, and no explanation in sight. He said he wanted me on the case because the department couldn't afford a scandal. Keep it quiet, Logan. The press gets wind of this, and the city will think we've got a monster roaming the streets. His words weren't a request. They were an order wrapped in desperation. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the dust dancing in the sunlight. I hadn't had a challenge in months, and now I had one that could swallow me whole. I told him I'd take it, because that's what I do. Because I don't know how to walk away when the shadows start whispering. By the time I reached the first crime scene, the sun was already surrendering to grey clouds. A drizzle painted the sidewalks, giving the city that slick, haunted look it wears so well. The body lay in an alley off 5th, sprawled near a dumpster, face pale as porcelain. A young man, mid-20s maybe, with a hole where his chest should have been. His heart was gone, not torn out. Removed neat and clean, like someone had clocked in for surgery and clocked out with their prize. As a detective, I've seen my share of ugly endings, but this was different, too meticulous, too deliberate. Whoever did this knew their way around flesh and bone. And that's when it hit me. The kind of person who could pull this off wasn't just a street thug or a lunatic. This was someone with knowledge, someone who studied. The coroner on scene wouldn't look me in the eye. He muttered about precision, about instruments sharper than any knife you'd find in a kitchen drawer. Then he shoved his hands in his coat pockets and walked off like he'd rather forget he was ever here. I lit a cigarette, let the smoke curl up into the damp air, and thought about the mayor's warning. Keep it quiet. But how do you keep quiet when bodies are dropping like leaves in autumn? How long before the city smells the blood in the air? I started canvassing the block, talking to the kind of people who notice everything, but rarely get asked. Street vendors, janitors, the guy sweeping up glass outside a pawn shop. Most said they saw nothing. But one old woman, hunched in a doorway with eyes sharper than they had any right to be, swore she saw a man in a long coat leaving the alley just before dawn. Said he walked like he didn't belong here, too careful, too clean. She pointed east toward the river. Then she crossed herself and went silent. I jotted it down, but my gut told me this wasn't just about one man in a coat. This was bigger. Back at my office, I poured myself a drink and spread the reports across my desk. 3 bodies so far. 1 missing skin, 1 missing limbs, and the one I saw tonight with no heart. No fingerprints, no footprints, no leads. Just bodies like puzzles missing half their pieces. That's when I started thinking about how thin I was stretched. Cases like this, you need someone keeping the files straight, following the threads while you're out chasing ghosts. I've been telling myself I could handle it alone, that I didn't need an assistant. But the truth, the piles on my desk said otherwise. Still, wanting help and trusting someone enough to bring them into your world are 2 different things. So I pushed the thought away like I always do. Instead, I poured another glass and went back over the files, eyes heavy, head buzzing with half-formed theories. Somewhere between the second sip and the sound of the rain picking up outside, I noticed something. The coroner's notes weren't consistent. The first body was logged as found near the train yard. The second, at a construction site. The third, the alley I'd just come from. Different corners of the city, but all of them eventually ended up in the same place. The morgue. The morgue. I stubbed out my cigarette and leaned forward. I'd been so focused on the crime scenes, I hadn't thought much about what happened after. But all roads were leading there. And there was one man who saw every body, every wound, every missing piece. Dr. Arthur Crane, former medical professor, now working at the city morgue after his career had gone sour. I remembered his name from a case years back. Sharp, ambitious, but always one step away from a scandal. Word was he lost his position at the university after some financial mess, the kind of fall from grace that leaves a man bitter, broke, and dangerous. I knew I had to pay him a visit, but before I could make a move, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't the mayor. It was a voice I didn't recognize. Low, rough, like gravel under a boot. The caller didn't bother with introductions. He just said, "Detective, if you keep digging, you won't like what you find." Then the line went dead. I sat there staring at the receiver, the smoke from my last cigarette curling into nothing. Someone knew I was on the trail. Someone wanted me off it, but threats don't scare me off. They just tell me I'm getting close. The city was still dripping rain when I grabbed my coat and headed out. I had one name in mind and one place to start. Dr. Arthur Crane, waiting among the dead. But when I reached the morgue, the lights inside flickered, and the night guard outside wouldn't meet my eyes. Something had already gone wrong. And the first thing I saw when I pushed open those heavy doors froze me in place. There was another body on the slab, fresh, and this one was missing more than just skin or bone. The body on the slab looked like it had been hollowed out. No blood, no organs, no trace of what made it human. Just a shell, a cruel mockery of life, left behind for me to find. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, throwing sickly green shadows across the room, and the air was thick with formaldehyde and silence. Dr. Arthur Crane stood at the far end of the morgue, white coat buttoned up to his neck, hands clasped neatly behind his back. He had the air of a man who'd been waiting for me. His hair was thinner than I remembered, his eyes sharper. When he smiled, it was the kind of smile that knew more than it should. "Detective Logan," he said, voice smooth, academic. "I wondered when you'd come. As a detective, you learn to listen not just to what's said, but how it's said." Crane didn't sound surprised. He sounded rehearsed, like my arrival had been penciled into his schedule. That alone set alarms ringing in my head. I walked closer, eyes flicking between him and the body. "Strange times, Crane. People are showing up around town in pieces. Thought maybe you'd have something useful to tell me." He adjusted his glasses and gave the body a casual glance, as though it were a half-finished assignment he'd grown bored of. "It's a tragedy, yes, but this city has always had its share of unconventional crimes. I process what arrives here, nothing more. It was too smooth, too careful, like a man trying to keep his hands clean while standing ankle-deep in blood." Before I could press him, the morgue door creaked open. A uniformed officer stepped in, face pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. He whispered something into Crane's ear, but his eyes kept darting to me, nervous, like a kid caught stealing candy. Crane dismissed him with a flick of the hand. The officer left without a word. That exchange gnawed at me. Why was an officer whispering to the morgue attendant like they were co-conspirators? I pulled out my notebook and flipped it open, more for show than anything. 3 bodies before this one, each with something missing. "Tell me, Doc, you ever see precision like that outside a medical theater?" His eyes flicked to me, then away, landing on the cadaver. "I taught anatomy for 20 years, Detective. I know what careful work looks like. Whoever's behind this one has discipline, skill. This isn't a savage killing, this is deliberate." He said it with a strange pride, like an artist describing brushstrokes, and that was all I needed to hear for now. I left the morgue with rain still hammering the streets, and my suspicions circling like vultures. Crane was hiding something, but suspicion isn't evidence, not yet. The next day I started knocking on doors. Victims don't always speak, but the lives they leave behind often do. The first was the young man with the missing heart. His name was Jeremy Fields, a med student who'd been scraping by with late-night shifts at a diner. His landlady remembered him as quiet, polite, and behind on rent. But his desk was stacked with anatomy textbooks, surgical notes, and applications to internships he never got. The second was a construction worker named Donnie Moore, the one missing limbs. No medical background. But in his wallet, I found a business card for a lecture series at the university. Guess who had been listed as the speaker before his career went south? Dr. Arthur Crane. Patterns, threads weaving together. I decided to visit the third victim's family. A woman named Clara, 28, found skinless in the train yard. Her sister answered the door, eyes swollen from crying, voice trembling as she described Clara's fascination with medical mysteries. She'd been writing papers for a community college class about the ethics of dissection. I asked who her professor was. The sister pulled out an old syllabus, edges curled from use. There it was again. Crane. 3 victims. All roads leading back to the same man. But here's the catch. Any detective worth his salt knows red herrings come dressed in the finest clothes. The moment the evidence seems too neat, too lined up, that's when you start asking yourself if you're being led by the nose. I started digging into Crane's background. Not just the university, but his finances, his habits, his vices. That's when I uncovered the cracks. Creditors knocking on his door. Gambling debts with names attached that you don't want on your bad side. He'd gone from a respected professor to a man sleeping in his office at the morgue. And in that kind of desperation, people make choices they'd never consider otherwise. Still, I needed more. Something tangible. So I went back to the morgue late one night, long after closing. The night guard had stepped out for a smoke, leaving the door barely locked. I slipped inside, flashlight in hand, and started searching Crane's office. The drawers were a mess of unpaid bills, overdue notices, and letters from the university, polite but firm reminders of his disgrace. But then I found a folder, thick, heavy. Inside were photos, not the kind you'd want to stumble on in the dead of night. They were of the bodies, not just as they arrived, but during the dissections, each labeled with precise notes in Crane's handwriting. Angles of incisions, lists of missing organs, measurements. This wasn't record-keeping. This was obsession. But what chilled me most wasn't the notes themselves. It was the final page. A list. Not of bodies, but of names. 10 of them. 3 already crossed out. And at the bottom of that list, my name. I shut the folder and shoved it into my coat, heart pounding like a war drum. Crane wasn't just documenting, he was planning. I left the morgue with the rain still falling, but this time it felt different. He wasn't just a suspect anymore, he was a predator. And I was next on his list. The next day I tried to confront him, but Crane was gone. His office was empty. The morgue attendants claimed they hadn't seen him since the night before, like he'd vanished into the cracks of the city. That's when I started feeling the pressure. Everywhere I went, eyes followed me, strangers lingering a second too long, cars idling outside my building. Whoever Crane was working with, or for, was watching me now. I poured myself another drink that night, staring out the window of my office as neon lights flickered across the wet pavement below. I'd wanted a case to break the monotony. Now I had one that might break me. The phone rang again, same rough voice as before. "Detective," it growled, "you don't understand what you're dealing with. Stop now, or you'll end up like the rest." But what I found next changed everything. The line went dead before I could answer, but the warning sat in the room with me like a second shadow. I've been threatened before, comes with the job, but this one carried weight, not just fear, but inevitability, like I'd already stepped too far onto a road with no way back. Still, I wasn't about to let Crane vanish into the night with my name scribbled onto his death ledger. I needed leverage, something solid to drag him out of the dark. That meant going through the victims again, thread by thread until the tapestry started to make sense. I began with Jeremy Field's medical textbooks. They weren't just general anatomy. Tucked between the pages were notes that didn't belong to him. Different handwriting, older, more refined. Phrases like arterial preservation and clean separation of dermal layers. Clinical, obsessive. It read more like lesson plans than study notes. Crane's fingerprints were all over them, even if his name wasn't. That gave me an idea. If Crane had been using these victims as some twisted continuation of his lectures, then maybe his old students could fill in the blanks. Professors leave imprints on their classes. Some inspire, some haunt. Crane, I suspected, did both. I tracked down a few ex-students at a bar near the university, a dive joint where the jukebox hadn't worked in years and the air reeked of stale beer. One of them, a thin guy with darting eyes who introduced himself as Mason, nursed a whiskey like it was medicine. When I mentioned Crane, he flinched. Guy was brilliant, Mason said, but strange. Talked about anatomy like it was an art form. Said the body wasn't just a machine, it was clay waiting for the right hands to sculpt it. Another student, a woman named Carla, leaned in close, voice hushed. He kept pushing us, wanted us to volunteer for extra dissections. Most of us refused, but there were always rumors he'd find other ways to keep practicing. Off the record. The table went quiet after that, and I knew I'd hit the nerve I was looking for. Crane had always been chasing something beyond medicine, something darker. I left them to their drinks and stepped into the wet night. The city's neon lights blurred through the drizzle, painting everything in sickly colors. I pulled my coat tight and tried to connect the dots. Crane lost his career, his reputation, his money. But his obsession? That never left. If anything, it grew sharper in the shadows. The question was, why now? Why these particular victims? That answer came sooner than I expected. 2 nights later, another body turned up. This one at the docks. A fisherman found it floating face down in the oily water, skin pale and stretched thin. The chest cavity had been carefully opened, lungs gone, stitched shut like some grotesque experiment. When I arrived, the harbor lights flickered on the black water, casting long, jittering shadows. The fisherman was shaking too hard to talk. The uniforms on site kept their distance, muttering about curses and madmen. I knelt beside the body, the stench of salt and rot crawling up my throat, and studied the stitches. Same precision, same hand. But something was different. This time, a clue was left behind. Not hidden, not by accident. A scrap of paper folded tight, tucked into the corpse's pocket. I pulled it out, careful not to rip it. The writing was neat, deliberate. One line. The body is the canvas. The city is the gallery. And you, detective, are my audience. Crane wasn't hiding anymore. He was performing. I lit a cigarette, letting the smoke burn the chill from my lungs, and stared out over the black waves. This wasn't just about obsession. It was about recognition. Crane wanted me watching. He wanted me chasing. Which meant he was leading me somewhere. Back at my office, I pinned the note to the wall alongside the names, the photos, the maps. Threads stretched across the city like veins. The docks, the train yard, the construction site. Each body placed deliberately, spread wide, forcing me to cover more ground. A performance designed for one man, me. I poured myself a drink, but the whiskey did nothing to quiet the storm in my head. If Crane was staging this, then there had to be a finale. Something bigger, something that would outshine the rest. And if I didn't find it first, more bodies would pay the price. That night I barely slept. Dreams of hollow bodies and stitched flesh kept dragging me awake, sweat cold on my skin. When dawn finally bled through the blinds, I knew I had to press harder. I went back to the morgue, folder still in my coat. The night guard eyed me suspiciously, but I flashed my badge and pushed past him. Crane's office was still empty, desk abandoned. But I noticed something I hadn't before. A locked cabinet against the far wall. The kind of lock you don't waste on spare gloves. I forced it open with a screwdriver. Inside were jars, dozens of them, each labeled, each containing what the bodies had been missing. Hearts, lungs, kidneys preserved in cloudy liquid. It was a grotesque collection, a museum of his work. But there was more. Behind the jars, a journal. I flipped it open. Page after page of neat handwriting, diagrams of organs, sketches of surgical cuts, and between the medical notes, something else. Plans, coordinates, dates. The next date was circled in red. Tomorrow. Location. City Hall. I felt my stomach drop. Crane wasn't just taking victims from the shadows anymore. He was planning to bring his gallery to the mayor's doorstep. I slammed the cabinet shut and left the morgue, heart hammering. This wasn't just about catching him anymore. It was about stopping whatever spectacle he had planned before it tore the city apart. But as I stepped into the rain, I caught sight of a man across the street. Long coat, hat pulled low. He was watching me. When our eyes met, he turned and melted into the crowd. I gave chase, boots splashing through puddles, weaving between startled pedestrians. The man ducked into an alley, and for a moment I thought I had him cornered. But when I reached the end, the alley was empty. Just shadows and dripping pipes. On the wall, scratched into the brick with something sharp, were two words: too late. I stood there, breath ragged, the city pressing down on me. Crane was always one step ahead, pulling the strings, turning the whole city into his stage. And tomorrow night the curtain was going to rise at City Hall. City Hall loomed over me the next evening like a cathedral of power, its marble steps slick with rain, its windows glowing faintly in the dark. The mayor had insisted the gala go forward despite the threat. Said cancelling would send the wrong message to the public. Politicians worry about appearances, detectives worry about bodies, and I knew we were about to get plenty of those if Crane had his way. I stationed myself near the entrance, coat collar turned up, hat low over my eyes. Guests filed in under umbrellas, laughing, unaware of the storm brewing inside. I scanned every face, every movement, but Crane wasn't going to stroll through the front doors with a ticket in hand. He was a man who thrived in shadows, and shadows don't pay admission. I slipped inside before the mayor arrived, moving through the ornate hallways like I belonged there. Chandeliers glittered above polished marble floors, and the smell of perfume fought with the scent of damp coats. Too bright, too cheerful, like painting over rot. My gut told me Crane was already inside. I checked the service corridors, the stairwells, the rooms no one bothers with. That's when I heard it, a faint hum, mechanical, behind a locked maintenance door. I forced it open and found myself staring at a tableau that froze me in place. Bodies, or pieces of them, arranged in glass cases like exhibits, hearts suspended by wires, limbs carefully posed, skin stretched like parchment across frames, each labeled in Crane's neat handwriting, Specimen A, Specimen B. A grotesque gallery hidden beneath City Hall, and standing in the middle of it all was Crane. He looked different now, disheveled, eyes burning with manic purpose, his white coat stained, sleeves rolled to his elbows. When he saw me, his face split into a grin that sent ice crawling down my spine. "Detective Logan," he said, voice echoing in the chamber. "You made it. I was afraid you'd miss the opening." I drew my gun, steadying it on him. "It ends tonight, Crane. Step away from your exhibit." He laughed. Not the nervous laugh of a guilty man, but the delighted laugh of someone who thinks he's already won. "You don't understand. These people were wasted out there, forgotten. I gave them purpose, art, immortality. And tonight, the city will see the truth." He gestured to a covered frame in the center of the room. Slowly, theatrically, he pulled the cloth away. Beneath it was a figure assembled from pieces of the victims. A patchwork body, sewn together with meticulous care, posed upright like a sculpture. I kept my gun trained on him, but my mind raced. He wasn't just killing, he was creating. This was never about organs or money. This was obsession, madness dressed in the trappings of genius. "I lost everything," Crane said, stepping closer, hands raised like a conductor before an orchestra. "My career, my respect, my name. But here, in this gallery, I'm more than a man. I'm a creator. And you, detective, you're my final audience, the only one who can truly appreciate it." I took a step forward, voice low and steady. "You're not an artist, Crane. You're a butcher, and the only thing you'll be remembered for is the lives you stole." For a moment, his face twisted, the veneer of control cracking. Then he lunged, hand flashing toward a scalpel on the table. I fired, the shot echoing off marble and glass. Crane staggered, scalpel clattering to the floor. He looked down at the spreading red on his coat, then up at me, eyes wild but still burning with that feverish pride. "You'll never stop the art," he whispered, collapsing to the ground. The room went silent, save for the dripping rain outside. I lowered my gun, breath heavy, and called it in. By the time the uniforms arrived, the gala above was still in full swing, oblivious to the horror buried beneath their feet. They carried Crane's body out under a sheet, the gallery dismantled piece by piece, each jar and frame bagged as evidence. The mayor thanked me personally, his voice tight with relief, promised to keep it quiet, spin the story as some tragic accident at the morgue. politics at work. But I didn't care about the spin. My concern was the families who'd never get their people back whole, the lives reduced to exhibits in Crane's twisted masterpiece. Later that night, back in my office, I poured myself a drink and sat in the dark. The rain had stopped, but the city still felt drenched in shadows. Cases like this leave marks, not just on the city, but on the man who walks through them. I thought about the folder with my name on it, about how close I'd come to ending up as part of his display, and about the piles of files on my desk, growing heavier every day. An assistant would have helped, someone to keep the chaos straight, but I wasn't ready to let anyone in. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I lit a cigarette, the smoke curling in the lamplight, and stared out at the city. Crane was gone, but there would always be another shadow waiting, another case, another nightmare dressed as a puzzle. That's the life of a detective. You don't get peace, you get moments between storms, and when the next one comes, you stand, you light another cigarette, and you walk straight into it. Because if you don't, who will? So I raised my glass to the night, to the city, to the ones lost in the dark. And then I whispered the only truth that keeps me going. The dead don't rest easy in this town, and neither do I.